The heat of the Pacific, more than a climatic condition, was a metaphor for the intensity of combat, a force consuming logic, loyalty, and hope. Far from the busy skies of Europe, the war on the islands was a succession of brutal clashes, where the jungle, the mud, and humidity conspired as much as the enemy. It was intimate fighting, waged in flooded trenches, coral dugouts, and dark caves, where the sound of hand grenade, echoing underground, was the last melody heard by many men. The theater of operations, vast and discontinuous, imposed its own combat logic, where mobility and logistical weight became enemies as relentless as the opposing infantry. Strategy here did not shout. It drowned in sweat and blood, a reality of slow and painful attrition. Every square meter of conquered ground was paid for with the highest currency, and the psychological dimension was, at times, more exhausting than the physical. Pacific combat offered neither the safety of defined fronts nor the possibility of an organized retreat in open country. The enemy, often invisible, emerged from the ground or the treetops, turning every advance into a life-or-death negotiation with the environment. For the Marine, metal, however little, represented an almost mythical barrier against the vulnerability of flesh. This was the aura surrounding the Type 95 light tank, known to the Japanese as a Hago. The Hago was the iron knight of an infantry that made determination its primary shield. Conceived in the 1930s, it was born from a military philosophy that prioritized speed and operational range over protection. Its original mission was infantry support and reconnaissance in the difficult terrains of the Far East and Manchuria, where armored opposition was rare or non-existent. Small, weighing less than 8 tons, agile for its time, and armed with 37mm cannon. It was, above all, the symbol of the imperial advanced capability in a war where the Navy and Air Force took center stage, but the infantry still needed its mechanical impetus. The strategists who designed it did not aim for resistance against heavy projectiles. The side and rear armor, in particular, used only 12mm of steel, optimized to withstand rifle-caliber projectiles. The philosophy behind its construction was a direct reflection of the contemporary Japanese military doctrine, profoundly influenced by Bushido. The spirit and audacity of the infantry would compensate for any material deficiency. The metal was an encouragement, not a guarantee. The belief was that a surprise attack, swift and determined, would negate the need for heavy armor. It was a doctrine that ignored the cold arithmetic of industry and ballistics. However, as the months passed and the tide of war turned with the arrival of American industrial production, the technical reality of the Hago project began to collide dramatically with the new tactical reality. The Hago was a weapon of the past brought into a future for which it was not designed, a future where Allied firepower grew exponentially. For the Marines, newly arrived in that vortex of islands, the Japanese tank was initially a figure of tactical terror. The presence of any armor in an infantry attack caused immense psychological pressure. Fear has the capacity to magnify the enemy. Moving steel represented a threat that the infantry's portable weapons took time to learn to neutralize efficiently. Early combat reports, coming from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and other initial points, showed that while the Hago was technically vulnerable to anti-tank cannons, it could still decide a clash, especially at night or in ambushes. The Marine, accustomed to the rifle and the grenade, found himself before the overwhelming indifference of machine. War was measured in inches of steel, and the difference in technology seemed insurmountable. Allied doctrine quickly tried to adapt. It was necessary to demystify the tank's invulnerability, which was a symbol of resistance. To win, the soldier needed to strip the metal of its psychological power. The main challenge was not just destroying the tank, but freeing the soldier's mind from the terror it represented. For every Hago destroyed by a cannon shot, 100 others needed to be neutralized by the confidence of the infantry. The turning point, which would shift from dread to derision, occurred on one of the countless atolls forgotten on the map, an anonymous battlefield where the war seemed to have paused only to concentrate on a few square kilometers. At that moment, the Hago was preparing for one of its last acts of prominence. Japanese forces, trapped on the defensive and with logistics collapsing, saw in their few armored vehicles the only hope for counterattacks that might, perhaps, break the American supply lines. It was a strategy of desperation, almost sacrificial, but it was all they had left. The Hago though weak against American medium armor, was still lethal against exposed infantry. The threat, therefore, was real and the tension mounting. The American infantry, supported by some more modern tanks like the M4 Sherman, was prepared for confrontation, but the uncertainty was still palpable. Between duty and self-preservation, many wonder what the cost in lives of that coming night would be. This silent dilemma, the doubt lodged between the heart and the trigger, is the deepest mark of the combat experience. Tactical uncertainty turns the soldier into the loneliest of men. In a torn diary from a Green Marine, found in a punctured helmet, we read, "Today, we saw 3 of them. They moved slow like metal spiders. I counted 18 prayers on my watch. I don't pray to be strong. I pray to be fast. The strength belongs to the commander. Speed is all I have left. They say the machine gun does nothing to them, but when fear tightens, you shoot at anything. It's our way of saying we are still here, that the metal won't swallow us." This young soldier's reflection captures the solitude of the infantry facing armor. Reaction time is the only frontier between life and loss. It is speed that saves, not resilience. The metal imposed its own liturgy of anxiety, and the only answer was the attempt, however futile, to pierce the monster. The moral tension increased with every twilight. The sound of engines on the horizon, still muffled, was like the tolling bell announcing the end of peace. The night operation was a logistical nightmare. In the dark, all tanks seemed bigger, faster, more menacing. The infantry depended on precise coordination of their own armor, but mainly on their own audacity and confidence in their support weapons. The commanding sergeant knew that if the weapons failed, only hand-to-hand combat against the steel would remain, an unfavorable duel. The confrontation was not long in coming. Amidst the noise of explosions and machine gun fire, the Japanese assault group, led by 3 Hagos, attempted a penetration on the weakest flank of the line. The sound of the tanks tearing through the vegetation was loud, metallic, and carried with it the smell of burning diesel. For the Marine, it was the personification of the relentless advance. What happened next was not the result of an elaborate plan, but a confluence of desperation and science. A group of Marines cornered had fired their heavy machine gun, the ubiquitous .50 cal, 12.7 millimeters caliber, in a frantic burst in the general direction of the tank, more as an act of self-defense to keep their heads down than as a planned anti-tank shot. The American heavy machine gun was a high-caliber, high-rate-of-fire weapon, typically used against aircraft or infantry positions, but not against armor whose main plating was designed to withstand such a caliber. What followed was a moment that named the episode, transforming dread into a mix of surprise and nervous laughter. The Japanese tank did not just stop. It reacted in an unusual way. The burst of 12.7 millimeter armor-piercing ammunition, concentrated at a specific point, did not ricochet. It penetrated the thin side armor of the Hago, a design that used only 12 millimeters of surface-hardened steel. The technical explanation for the phenomenon was already recorded in another fragment. In a passage from a document, drafted by an Allied field engineer even before the decisive confrontation, the technical analysis already pointed to Flaw. The alloy used in the side and rear panels of the Type 95 Hago does not meet resistance standards for medium calibers. Japan prioritized weight and speed over side protection. In theory, any 12.7 millimeters half-inch armor-piercing projectile can penetrate, given a good angle. The cost of haste is the protection of the men operating it. Engineering yields the strategy. The historian comments, the Flaw was not born on the battlefield. It was born on the drawing board. It is proof that decisions made in silence, thousands of miles away, can be as lethal as a stray bullet. Technical warfare does not forgive logistical compromises. The Japanese builders paid the price for betting the enemy would never have such a potent machine gun in every squad, or that they would never manage to flank. The burst into flank of the 3rd Hago was the brutal verification of this thesis. What followed were dry, rapid echoes of metal against metal, followed by a hollow sound and the emergence of smoke from inside the armored vehicle. The tank was neutralized. The armor of that tank was, at that point, laughably vulnerable. In a combat report from a veteran sergeant, dated that same dawn, the description is stark and objective. Third tank turned to the flank. Infantry fired .50 cal and sustained bursts into the side of the turret and hull. Tank stopped. No explosion, just internal smoke. The armor-piercing rounds went through like paper. The Ha-Go tank did not withstand a machine gun. From now on, all commanders must be notified. Priority is to flank and hit the sides and engine with the 12.7 millimeters. Here, bureaucratic language becomes a vector of a tactical revolution. The naked truth is that the support weapon became an easy target for something that wasn't even an anti-tank weapon. Human fragility was contained within the fragility of the metal. The discovery spread like wildfire. The Type 95 light tank, the Ha-Go, was not invulnerable. Its armor could not only be penetrated, it could be dominated by a heavy machine gun operated by a single man. That moment was not a grandiose tactical victory, but a monumental psychological one. The sound of the .50 cal that followed was no longer the sound of despair, but the sound of the nervous laughter men who had just found the key to the steel enigma that terrified them. Fear was replaced by the sudden, terrible, and liberating understanding of a fatal flaw. From that point on, the combat in the Pacific would change forever. The metal meant to protect became a trap, and the arrogance of design a sentence. To understand the dimension of this failure, one must analyze the contrast between the two military doctrines in conflict. The German regime based its strength on heavy armor, on the primacy of the blitzkrieg, or lightning war, where protection was as important as speed. In contrast, the German forces faced the Soviet Union with equally robust tanks, like the T-34, in Europe. It was a war of heavy blows. In the Pacific, the Japanese imperial doctrine was almost the opposite, a focus on the spiritual quality of the soldier, on swift advance, and on reliance on camouflage and surprise attack, rather than armor. The Ha-Go reflected this mindset. It was light enough to be transported on smaller ships and operate in jungles and swamps. It was a compromise with the environment, which became an Achilles heel when confronted with the mass production and firepower of the United States. American engineering, in turn, developed the M2 Browning .50 cal as a multitask weapon, capable of engaging low-flying aircraft and supporting infantry against light defenses. The fact that this weapon accidentally became a tank hunter is a testament to the pragmatic genius of American design, which valued utility and versatility. The Ha-Go succumbed not to an anti-tank monster, but to an omnipresent utility weapon. This difference in values, unwavering spirit versus industrial logistics, reached its saturation point in the side of that Ha-Go. It was the end of illusion. The discovery of the Ha-Go's fatal fragility was not just a tactical adjustment. It was a seismic shift in the perception of power. The laughter that echoed among the Marines was not of easy derision, but the nervous laughter of someone who has just escaped a nightmare. Finding the key under the mat, the tank, once a miniature fortress, was now seen as a fragile shell, and the .50 cal machine gun ascended to the status of tank hunter. This instantaneous reevaluation transformed American doctrine in the Pacific, giving the infantry a reliable weapon against enemy armor, freeing up precious bazookas and artillery support for more resilient targets. From that decisive point, combat ceased to be a battle of machines and became a precision hunt. The Marine learned not to aim at the center of the steel mass, but to flank, targeting the side of the vehicle, the ventilation openings, or the rear engine compartment. The noise of the Ha-Go's engine, which once announced death, now sounded like an invitation to confrontation. This tactical shift was more than logistical. It was a triumph of field intelligence over industrial design. Knowledge in war is the most potent of explosives. The soldier, by understanding the enemy's weakness, not only protects himself, but empowers himself. The morale of the American troops soared. The fear of the tank, a deep, primitive anxiety of man against machine, was neutralized. This renewed confidence unleashed the infantry's tactical aggression, allowing them to advance with greater boldness against fortified positions, knowing they could handle armored counterattacks with the weapons they already carried. Improvisation became a hallmark of that theater of war. Man, with his shrewdness and persistence, had uncovered the machine's mystery, and the war became once again a duel of wills, not just resources. Loyalty to the machine gun overcame the dread of the armor. On the opposing side, The news of the Type 95's vulnerability spread with devastating impact. Japanese tank operators were already facing logistical isolation and American air superiority, but discovering that their main armored asset could be neutralized by a heavy machine gun was a blow to morale that few could absorb. The belief in the superiority of spirit over matter, a pillar of imperial doctrine, collapsed before the harsh reality of the 12.7 millimeters caliber. The tank, which was supposed to encourage the infantry, became a rolling steel coffin, attracting concentrated heavy machine gun fire. Communication about this flaw, however, was complex. Within the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese forces, admitting a design flaw was more than a tactical error. It was a stain on honor. Many field reports describing Hago losses attempted to obscure the true cause, attributing it to bazookas or anti-tank mines, rather than the humiliation of a machine gun. This bureaucratic denial cost lives and prevented tactical adjustments on many islands that would still be defended with this armor model. War often is fought not only against the enemy but against institutional inertia and the vanity of its leaders. The climax of this episode is not an explosion, but the choice presented to every Hago crewman. Between obeying the order to advance and the consciousness of their vehicle's fragility, many discovered that the most difficult war was the one they fought within themselves. Loyalty to the commander and the regime conflicted with the certainty that the armor no longer protected. This tension between duty and self-preservation is manifested in another documentary fragment from an anonymous diary, possibly from one of the men operating the Hago's 37mm cannon, somewhere in the Marianas Campaign. The heat inside is unbearable, but the cold is knowing the hatch can't save us. The lieutenant says the steel is an incentive, not a shield. But what does he know of the sound when the armor-piercing round hits the side? It's not a boom. It's the sound of the bell shattering, and then the silence of the engine. No more noise. Just a sweet smell of oil and despair. I looked at my wife's photograph. I don't know what's harder, fighting out there or fighting in here, between the steel and the truth. The historian reflects, it is the solitude of the man within the metal. When the machine fails, the philosophy that created it also fails. The Hago, at that moment, was no longer a tank. It was a symbol of the fragility of unwavering faith, confronted with the relentless physics of armor-piercing ammunition. The spirit may be strong, but the law of ballistics is stronger than dogma. Defeat, in that theater of operations, took the form of an ever-tightening siege. The operation of the Hago, instead of breaking through, merely accelerated the inevitable. American tactics became even more refined. In a message radio intercepted and decoded that same time, coming from an American tactical leader, the urgency of the new doctrine was evident. Confirmed priority. All Jap light tanks must be engaged by 12.7mm weapons on the side, preferably in conjunction with rounds high explosive ammunition. Repeat, side armor is compromised. The infantry holds a key to the metal. Do not waste anti-tank ammunition. The historian considers, it is in this type of phrase that language becomes a shield for life. Suffering turns into tactical learning, and learning wipes away uncertainty. The infantry, who once saw the armored vehicle as an invincible monster, now viewed it as a safe with an exposed weak point. It was a demystification of terror in real time, dictated not by a general, but by a sergeant on the ground. Allied tanks, especially the Shermans, used the Hago's vulnerability as a marksmanship training opportunity, engaging it from afar and destroying it quickly. The war became a lesson in geometry and ballistics. The Hago, once a valuable asset, began to be seen as a dangerous liability by the very forces that used it. The strategic outcome for the Hago was its relegation to static defense. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, many of these tanks were buried and used as fixed pillboxes, where side armor was no longer concerned, but where mobility, which was its virtue, was lost. They ended the war like the soldiers who operated them, defending positions until their last breath, tied to the land they were supposed to have conquered. The final irony of the title, Laughing at Armor, encapsulates the psychological transition of the war. It was not the massive firepower of artillery, nor the terror of new weapons that first broke the spirit of Japanese armor invincibility. It was the cold intelligence and resilience of a soldier with a machine gun. The lesson of this episode transcends metal and ammunition. It teaches us that vulnerability is not just a technical flaw, but a human condition. War, in its strategic coldness, always finds a weak spot, be it 12mm steel panel or the unquestioning belief in a doctrine. Fragility is inherent in all human endeavors, whether tactical or moral. What do the Ha-Go and its fatal flaw teach us about courage, faith, and obedience? They show us that true courage lies not in feeling invulnerable, but in persisting despite the certainty of fragility. Metal, no matter how strong it seems, is always less resilient than the human spirit that learns, adapts, and ultimately overcomes. Faith, in war, is found in adaptation, and blind obedience is always less useful than careful observation. The engines fell silent long ago, and the hot island air no longer smells of diesel and burn metal. But the echo of the choices made that night, the sergeant's choice to shoot, the engineer's choice to warn, and the soldier's choice to laugh at fear, still resonates in human memory. It is a reminder that every machine has a breaking point, and history is often written by those who have the audacity to seek out that flaw. The snow has erased the soldier's footprints on the field, but not the weight of the decisions made there. Knowledge, not steel, is the strongest armor a soldier can wear.